we are going to move the agenda here. And well, this is certainly a related phenomenon. It's like the far right surging everywhere, and all of them are using this opportunity to pay fealty to Israel. Javier Milei says he's actually going to convert to Judaism, the new president of Argentina. But nonetheless, to help put all this in context, we are very happy to be joined once again by the very worldly Zoe Alexandra, journalist and co-editor of People's Dispatch. Zoe, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm happy that you decided to come on the show. I know we gave you quite the brief here, but from Geert Wilders to Javier Milei, it seems that we have this sort of rising trend around the world again of the far right, all trying to kind of capitalize right now, of course, as well, on their bona fides vis-a-vis Israel. So that's not really a question, but maybe tell me what you think about that.
It's definitely an interesting phenomenon. I mean, on one hand, the rise of the right is something that we've been seeing for the past several years. We've seen kind of how neoliberalism has destroyed the working class across the world and how far-right leaders have really filled that vacuum. Argentina is an extremely, poignant example of that. I'll be honest, I think the fealty to Israel and the kind of extreme running towards the Zionist lobby, it's logical. It makes sense in terms of political orientation, but I will say it does seem, I guess it's not surprising for the moment, but I don't know if we've seen this sort of pivot, this really hard pivot in recent times, and especially from the far right. Given that they often have quite anti-Semitic politics. And of course, this just goes to show that actually Zionism is not about Judaism, even more so. But when you have someone like Javier Milei, he's clearly, I think, isolated, and he sees the possibility of allying with Israel at a moment where Israel is actually quite isolated on the international stage, probably is an opportunity for some sort of insulation. He's not super far thinking and doesn't necessarily have that kind of medium-term strategic vision, which is clearly why he wants to dollarize the economy and dissolve the central bank. But I think he sees this as sort of a short-term buoy in terms of like, okay, how do I most quickly get on the side of the United States? And then I think with the case of our of the fellow in the Netherlands, who's still kind of he did win many seats in the snap elections. Unclear how the building of that ruling coalition will happen, but this does seem sort of in line with really across the political spectrum in Europe. Very, very few voices are speaking out against Israel. We saw Ursula von Leyen in the early days of Israel's genocidal attacks on Gaza, that she was standing firm, standing in Israel, having a huge projection of the Israeli flag onto, I think, the building of the European Union. So that is definitely in lockstep. But I think that the Javier Milei trend is definitely like a new development that's pretty wild, to be quite honest.
It is really wild, and I am a bit curious about like how this necessarily happened, because it wasn't entirely expected, but it's also happening in conjunction with what we've seen as mentioned in the Netherlands, where you have the rise of Geert Wilders again, but in a more serious capacity. Can you talk a bit about that and maybe how this fits into a broader trend in certain countries, at least? Of this kind of rise of the far right in a particular time in history, I would say.
Definitely. And, I will acknowledge publicly here that when we talked about the Argentinian elections on this very show, I felt quite confident that Javier Milei would not win these elections due to his really outlandish positions, his clear attacks on the fundamental rights of the Argentinian people. And I think myself and many others stand corrected with his victory. But I think that, to kind of bring it back to your question, what that highlights is just the utter devastation to the livelihoods, towards the survival of working class people in Argentina. And, as we can see, an extension really across the world from neoliberalism. And I mean, in really every aspect of life. So in the case of Argentina, we're not just talking about the devastation to the Argentine peso and the inability of you to know, for example, from one day to the next, how much is your food going to cost to feed your family, because of the rapid devaluation of the currency, paired with crazily high levels of inflation. We're talking about not having access to any full-time jobs where you're guaranteed benefits or any sort of stability, at the same time that the jobs in the government are being decreased, labor rights are being whittled down to next to nothing. And so this is the context of course, this happened in Argentina, where we saw a huge devastation of the population, their socioeconomic conditions. Of course, under Mauricio Macri, who imposed very harsh austerity measures, and on top of that, took out billions of dollar loans from the IMF, which further, of course, called for the cutting of ministries, called for raising the price of basic services like electricity and heating, and other such things. And this saw 40% of the population being kind of plunged into poverty, an increase in homelessness. And that's the context. That's really the context within which figures like Milei emerge, where people's very social fabric is destroyed, because when you don't have access to food, when you don't know how you're going to feed your families, when you don't have any sort of possibility of a stable job that also has a huge, huge impact on, again, this social community life, on people's kind of ability to trust in the government, to trust in any sort of institution to provide you with any sort of stability. And so this is, of course, a socioeconomic phenomenon that we've seen in Argentina, in many countries across South America, but really across the entire world, and especially in Europe, which has gotten way worse, of course, with the war in Ukraine, where we've seen the cost of living crisis get even worse, where gas prices are increasing, electricity is increasing, all sorts of things are getting more expensive, and politicians don't really have a strong response to them. And so that is where people like Javier Milei come in with their tirades against the political caste that put the people in this situation, and really calling on people's pride, saying, are you going to let them do this to you? These sorts of provocations, and really speaking to this kind of vulnerable side of people that feel scared, that feel like they don't have any sort of security. So I think, going from the local to the broader to the international, I think this is, of course, with each country having its own specificities. Of course, in Europe, you have much more of the phenomenon on playing on xenophobia, on racism. In the Netherlands, this has been a huge, huge, huge issue. Wilders is more xenophobic than the rest of the candidates. That clearly put him in better standing, saying migrants are responsible for every single possible issue that anyone could be facing in the country, whether, having no explanation for people's socioeconomic conditions besides it's the problem of migrants, it's the problem of refugees. So these are sort of the broad trends, and then with these specific elements of each country's context. But these right-wing leaders are just capitalizing on these deep-seated fears, for sure.
Yeah, no, I think one of Geert Wilders' campaign points was to close all mosques, which just, if you couldn't be any clearer than that, no doubt about it. But I mean, as we were talking earlier about Henry Kissinger and sort of the more things changed, the more they stayed the same. And it's hard for me to look at, especially a country like Argentina especially someone like Javier Milei linking with Israel here, or at least attempting to, it's hard not to flash back a little bit to the Reagan era, and the use of the dirty war, the military dictatorships in Argentina, going hand in hand, of course, with the use of Israel, obviously, in the Middle East, and of course, always connections between the Contras and the apartheid South Africans and the military governments in Latin America. And it just feels in this moment of great, we've talked so much on this show about the changes in Latin America, especially the shifts in order to the left. And it just, I don't know exactly where I'm going with this here, but it just feels like that strategy of containment from that, 40 years ago, sort of a similar script playing out here.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen Milei speak specifically against, for example, other leaders in the region. He's gone on tirades against Andrés Manuel López Obrador. We see a huge contrast between Milei, for example, and Gustavo Petro, who since October 7th has been advocating for the Palestinian cause, advocating for an end to apartheid, for an end to Israeli occupation of Palestine. He's someone who definitely represents this kind of new wave, who's spoken out actually precisely about Israel's support to the militaries across Latin America, to Israel's complicity in human rights violations that have taken place across Latin America. So I think someone like Milei, who, connecting it again to the 70s Operation Condor moment, Milei is someone who says that human rights are an invention of people to gain money and to spread lies and to do criminal activities. He says that the 30,000 detained and disappeared during the dictatorship in Argentina, that's a fake number, that people are making this up, that this is a crazy crusade of these false human rights advocates. And so it definitely makes sense that all of these threads are kind of lining up. But I think that the general trend is not in that direction. I think that Milei, again, is extremely isolated. He has insane campaign promises, as I said before, dissolve the central bank, cut basically every ministry, which threatens really so many aspects of functioning in Argentina. But in addition to these ridiculous local and domestic policies, his international policies of cutting ties with Brazil and China, leaving all sort of regional integration platforms, now pledging all of this loyalty to Israel. But I think maybe he doesn't know it, but I think that we can see that he's really on a sinking ship, much like many of the supporters of Israel now see that the entire world is turning against Israel and the Zionist project right now. This is not a project of life, of future, of hope. It's a project that is trying to bring, regression and a politics of death. And I think that Milei has this short-term vision that this might give him a little leverage with the United States. It might give him that crucial support. But I think ultimately that's not really the direction the world is going in. And like many of his plans, it's not going to go anywhere fast.
Zoe, it's an honor to have you here. I just wanted you, since I get it wrong every single time, to give us the correct information for how people can view Give the People What They Want, which is a fantastic weekly roundup show from People's Dispatch.
Well, first, I encourage everyone on a daily basis, go to peoplesdispatch.org, get caught up on pressing international movement news, analysis, updates. And then every Friday at 11 a.m., Eastern time, it switches for Indian time because, there's daylight savings time. Check out Give the People What They Want with myself, Vijay Prashad, and Prashanth from People's Dispatch, giving you all the latest updates on your weekly news.
Indeed. Couldn't recommend it any higher. Peoplesdispatch.org. Give the people what they want Fridays at 11 a.m., not 10:30, although you're happy to go wait on their YouTube page. Zoe Alexandra, co-editor of People's Dispatch, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.